This video contains a text-to-speech voice. This allows me to make videos easier and faster than with my real voice. Hybrid battleships, also known as battle carriers, are a combination of both a functional warship and aircraft carrier. The ability to launch aircraft from a ship the size of a battleship while having the guns and armor of one seems like a genius idea. However, attaching a flight deck to any normal surface warship wasn't exactly the best choice. The first set of ships we will be discussing are the Ise Class Battleships. Ise and her sister, Hyuga, were typical dreadnought battleships. Ise and Hyuga were nothing special, just an improvement of the class preceding them. They had a length of 683 feet, a beam of 94 feet and a draft of nearly 30 feet. Their main armament consisted of 12, 14-inch guns housed in 6 twin turrets. Their secondary armament consisted of 20, 5-inch guns scattered throughout the superstructure. They were completed in the middle of the First World War, and had nothing major happen to them during or after the war. During the Second World War, Japan noticed the true threat of using carriers, and it unfortunately made them into a primary target for the Allies, and therefore, Japan ended up losing multiple carriers within a short period of time. Designing and constructing new ships wasn't something that could happen overnight, so in a desperate need to replace their lost ships, Japan decided to convert some of their existing and incomplete warships into carriers. Japan was already familiar with the reconstruction of large warships into carriers, as in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty took effect. This treaty was a naval agreement that limited the tonnage of new warships with the hopes on preventing a global arms race. These nations had to cancel the construction on many new ships in order to meet the new regulations. However, many incomplete battleships and battlecruisers had already fit the tonnage requirements for carriers, so while many ships were sold for scrap, these would be converted into fully operational carriers. Some specific ships Japan would end up converting during this time were their incomplete battleship Kaga and battlecruiser Akagi. Conversion began on Ise and Hyuga, but Japan needed new carriers immediately, so in 1943, Ise and Hyuga would end up sailing partially converted. The aftern pair of turrets were removed and were replaced with a 230-foot-long flight deck. The newly added flight deck was almost 100 feet at its widest and narrowed to about 40 feet at the stern. The rest of the ships remained the same, with the only key differences being new anti-aircraft guns were installed and, for whatever reason, they decided to remove the 5-inch secondary guns the ships carried. Ise and Hyuga couldn't launch aircraft safely, as there was obviously a massive superstructure in the way. They installed 2 catapults on Ise and Hyuga, one port and one starboard. These catapults rotated outward so the aircraft could safely leave the ship, and to retrieve them, a crane on the stern lifted them from the water below back onto the flight deck. The aircraft actually sat on a track used to guide them from the crane either back to the catapults or to the elevator leading down to the hangar. The flight deck was also fitted with turntables that rotated the aircraft to the appropriate track. Both ships' hangars could hold about 10 aircraft, and 2 would be operational on catapults at all times. More aircraft would be stored up on the flight deck. Although they were designed to hold around 20 planes, not all could be flown due to a lack of pilots and operational aircraft on board the ship. The crew of both ships abandoned the idea as a whole, and both ships would never launch a single plane. In November 1944, the catapults would finally be removed on both ships, but their flight decks would remain in place. Ise and Hyuga would continue service as normal battleships until, in April 1945, they were demoted into anti-aircraft platforms. Several days later, they were discovered by American aircraft, which heavily bombed the 2, and they sank in shallow water. A majority of both ships remained above the surface and were attacked again. All plans to salvage the ships were abandoned, and they sat there deteriorating until they were dismantled in place after the war ended. In 1915, the first 2 Courageous class battlecruisers were laid down. They were named Courageous and Glorious, and later a third, named Furious, would eventually be laid down as a subclass. As a typical battlecruiser, these ships were intentionally planned to be the size of a battleship as well have the guns of a battleship, but sacrificed armor for speed. Dreadnoughts of that time were very slow, and the easiest solution was to remove some of the armor to save weight in hopes it would increase the speed, thus creating the battlecruiser. Envisioned by Lord Fisher, the Courageous class battlecruisers were originally intended to be an improved version of the predecessing Renown class battlecruiser, but new naval restrictions set in 1915 prevented new ships from being constructed to be any larger than a cruiser. Not wanting to build a cruiser, Lord Fisher got creative and made a ridiculously large cruiser with large guns. These abominations were classified as light battlecruisers. To simplify it, they were more cruiser than battleship, allowing them to still fit the regulations. Courageous and Glorious were completed in 1916, and came out to a length of 786 feet and had a beam of 81 feet. They had a draft of around 25 feet, allowing them to operate in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea. Their armor was 3 inches thick, and would probably sink if you threw a few rocks at them. They had 4 15-inch main guns housed in 2 twin turrets, one forward and one aft. HMS Furious was redesigned from the first 2, with the main difference was that she was planned to have 2 18-inch guns housed in 2 single turrets, one forward and one aft like with her sisters. But Furious's forward main gun was never installed, so in actuality, she only carried her aft gun. This is something we are going to come back to later. With these battlecruisers being very lightweight, they could manage around a whopping 32 knot speed, which was very impressive, especially at the time. But it turns out it means absolutely nothing, as Google says that the preceding HMS Renown also managed a 32 knot speed. Now, with everyone questioning the design of these battlecruisers, the class received the nickname of the Outrageous class. Completed in June 1917, HMS Furious would end up becoming the only Courageous class battlecruiser to serve a unique purpose during the First World War. Her forward main gun was never installed because fitted there was a flight deck. Furious was the first hybrid battleship in existence. Her hangar could hold about 10 planes, and they were lifted from the hangar by a crane and placed onto a track, guiding the aircraft down the center of the flight deck, somewhat similar to Japan's Ise and Hyuga. But unlike the Japanese sister ships, Furious did not launch aircraft by catapult, but somehow a trolley system was used to assist the launch of the aircraft. It's unclear on how this actually worked, and I was unsuccessful on finding any specific information on it. The flight deck was 160 feet long, narrowing the further forward it went and even dipped downwards, meeting up with the bow. HMS Furious actually ended up being the first moving ship that a plane would land on. The commander of the squadron aboard Furious, Edwin Dunning, was the one who pulled it off. But the problem was that there was no proper landing deck, so pilots had very little room to work with. Dunning managed to land his plane on the ship a second time and made an attempt on a third, but when he tried to land his plane back onto Furious, his engine failed and ended up missing the ship by several feet. Unfortunately, he would not survive. Realizing the issue with landing planes on the flight deck, Furious was refitted with a second one, this time on her stern along with an additional hangar, also likely storing 10 additional aircraft. This flight deck was connected to the forward one and was used to safely land aircraft back onto the ship. In March 1918, Furious was finally brought back into service and now she was a fully operational aircraft carrier. You may have noticed it already, and the pilots would also soon notice it. Furious's flight deck was split amidships as her funnel and superstructure have not been removed. Ramps were installed around the superstructure as an easy fix, and her aircraft now had to navigate around it. Whose idea was this? In the early 20s, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed and it controlled the tonnage of a single ship and the combined tonnage of an entire fleet, and with the Courageous class battlecruisers being one of the worst forms of warship in existence, removing Courageous and Glorious was an ideal move. Furious was already an operational carrier, and with her high speeds, it was decided Courageous and Glorious would also be converted into fully functional carriers. Learning from HMS Furious, Courageous and Glorious would have their funnels and superstructures removed and a flight deck was constructed over them. A new funnel and smaller superstructure island was constructed on the starboard side of the flight deck on both ships, with the new flight decks being around 580 feet long and over 90 feet wide. Completed in 1928, HMS Courageous served in the Mediterranean Fleet until in 1930, her sister HMS Glorious had her conversion completed and she took her place. Courageous was reassigned to the Atlantic Fleet later that year. At some point during this time, HMS Furious was refitted like her sisters, but she still retained her forward flight deck when she was a battlecruiser. She was also put into the Atlantic Fleet. Both Courageous and Glorious would not survive the Second World War and only Furious came out as the sole survivor of her class. After the war, she was placed into reserve and was sold for scrap in 1948. In 1937, the Soviet Union planned a unique type of battleship carrier hybrid for themselves. The former company, Gibbs Brothers, now Gibbs and Cox, were the ones who came up with the hybrid's design. Two were planned, both to be constructed in the U.S. with an American design. One of the planned ships was rumored to be named Pobeda. The ships were planned to be around the size of the Montana Class Battleships, which would also never end up being constructed. If Project 1058 was planned to use a Montana hull, they would have been roughly 920 feet long and have a beam of about 120 feet, with a draft of 40 feet. The main guns had an option of being fitted with 12, 16-inch guns in 4 triple turrets, or to be fitted with 8, 18-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. They also would have had 28, 5-inch guns housed in 14 twin turrets, scattered throughout the ship. Their flight decks would have been roughly around 300 feet long and maybe 90 feet wide. They were planned to be long enough for aircraft to safely take off and land without any assistance. They also would have featured 2 elevators to transport aircraft from the flight deck to the hangar, which could store roughly 40 planes. They also were planned to have 2 catapults to launch some spotting aircraft and a crane to lift them back onto the ship. This obviously would have been useless, because there is a flight deck in the middle of the ship. After a couple years of designing, the designers initially deemed this ship impractical and having hybrid battleships wouldn't be as useful as previously thought, and the project was initially abandoned before the Second World War started. Hybrid battleships were a somewhat good idea, but like with many other warship concepts, the first few weren't great. Although HMS Furious was the only true fully functional hybrid, her flight deck was short, and while she sacrificed a main gun for it, her pilots struggled to take off and land safely and efficiently. Ise and Hyuga, if tested, would have had a similar issue. The design of Project 1058 was the closest to a fully operational hybrid battleship could have been. Was the hybrid battleship a genius warship concept? This answer is unclear as the designs never made it too far in development, but looking from what actually existed, it would be a no.